in the very little I could find about Julian Castro's record, not so good. With Bernie Sanders' durability exciting progressives at their potential to shape the Democratic race, a coalition of groups, many of them backed by the Vermont senator, are launching a preemptive strike against the Housing and Urban Development Secretary, Julian Castro, aimed at disqualifying him from consideration to be Hillary Clinton's running mate. Of course, this is Politico, so a lot of this is propaganda. Tuesday morning, the group emailed petitions to several million people attacking Castro on the relatively obscure issue of his handling of mortgage sales and launching a website with an unsubtle address, "Don't sell our homes to Wall Street." Yeah, that relatively obscure issue of him selling foreclosed on homes to Wall Street banks that led to those homes being foreclosed on. Look at that. They're just as open with their political aims to publicly discredit Castro as a progressive, latching on to the mortgage issue to seed enough suspicion to keep him off Clinton's short list. Quote, "It's a situation where the Clinton campaign wants Castro to be a major asset to her chances of winning the White House, and unless he changes his position related to foreclosures and loans, he'll be a toxic asset to the Clinton campaign," said Matt Nelson, the managing director for PresentDay.org, the nation's largest Latino organizing group that focuses on social justice. Quote, "All year, we've seen the candidates tripping over themselves to show how tough they'll be on Wall Street," said Kurt Walters, the campaign manager for Root Strikers, a 501c4 group of Demand Progress and its 2 million affiliated activists, who's planning to deliver the petitions to Castro's office when they're ready. Quote, "Then to turn around and take a step backwards on that exact question and put someone who has been doing the exact opposite. I think it would be tough for a lot of people who care about Wall Street accountability to get excited about that pick." By the coalition's calculations, HUD under Castro has sold 98% of the long delinquent mortgages it acquired through a program aimed at preventing foreclosures to Wall Street banks under Castro's watch, without anywhere near the number of needed strings attached. Of course, HUD said that figure is way off. And Nelson and Walters say that for a politician who's aiming to be considered the vice presidential prospect for both progressives and minority, Castro has done too much to help private equity firms like Blackstone instead of Black and Latino communities. Quote, "If Secretary Castro fails to create significant momentum in terms of stopping the sales of mortgages to Wall Street, then I do think it disqualifies him. But there's time left on the clock," said Jonathan Weston, the director of New York Community for Change, which was formed out of remains of the community activist group Acorn. "I think a lot of the progressive movement would not be in support of a Castro ticket if he fails to make traction here." So, what basically, in English, Julian Castro, as the director of Housing and Urban Development, instead of foreclosed homes, trying to come up with programs to make them affordable for working people, maybe to figure out a way to get the people that you foreclosed on back in their homes, since those homes mostly were foreclosed on because of the greed and illegal behavior. Oh, I sound like Bernie. The greed and illegal behavior of Goldman Sachs, Wells Fargo, Bank of America, Citigroup, JP Morgan, I could go on and on. Instead of actually trying to take those foreclosed homes on, many of you watching could have had your homes foreclosed on and put those people back in those homes, refinance their mortgages that they collapsed on. He sold 98% of those mortgages to Wall Street banks. That's like giving an arsonist the contract to rebuild the house that he burned down. Let me say that again. That's like giving an arsonist who burned down the house the contract to rebuild the house. And this guy's talking about his grandma and, bootstraps. It's unbelievable. And again, he's like a blank slate. He's like Beto O'Rourke. That's what they think. Beto O'Rourke does have a record because he served in Congress for several years. This guy doesn't have direct donors because he was the HUD secretary. But so all you could do is look at what he did as HUD. So that's one very, very not so progressive thing he did as HUD. And he better have answers for that. Better have answers for that. Another thing, and this comes to you from Dallas Observer, which is an alternative independent outlet in Dallas, Again, the importance of independent outlets, alternative media, to get the truth out. I didn't know this until I read about it this morning. Julian Castro really hurt the movement for desegregation in Dallas. If former San Antonio Mayor Julian Castro wants to be president of the U.S., maybe he'll come back to Dallas and tell us why, when he was President Barack Obama's Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, he killed our best shot at overcoming racial segregation. Castro is testing the waters for a 2020 bid. On his website, he says, quote, "Today, more than ever, we must work together to build an America where everyone, no matter who we are or where we come from, can thrive." But his best chance to do something concrete for equality came barely 4 months into his 2-year tenure as the boss at HUD. HUD had been investigating racial segregation in Dallas for 4 years and was just about to bring down the hammer when Castro took office. In a sweetheart deal with Dallas mayor, Castro deep-sixed the investigation, threw his own investigators at HUD under the bus, and let Dallas off with a kiss instead of a hammer. The HUD finding in Dallas was exactly the kind of case Castro's predecessor at HUD, Sean Donovan, had vowed to begin going after for a change. Donovan, Obama's second HUD Secretary, promised early on to pursue the deceptively benign-sounding policy of, quote, affirmatively furthering fair housing, which you and I might recall, which you and I might more readily recognize under its real name for racial desegregation. For these purposes, it doesn't matter too much whether we are for that or against it. Federal laws say that federal laws say if a city takes federal money intended to promote desegregation, think of it like taking federal dollars intended to decrease pollution and using the money instead to buy tanker trucks to dump poison into rivers. Just not right. But that's just what the 4-year federal probe said Dallas had been doing for a decade. Citing national research and court law, the report said so-called, quote, affordable housing in American cities actually comes down to housing for Black and Hispanic working class and poor people and people with disabilities. A city that uses HUD money to encourage the development of apartment projects must ensure that a majority of those apartments will go to people in certain specified categories. The way things work in the world today, the lion's share of those people are going to be non-white. In case anybody was unclear where the city wanted its more white and less white apartments, HUD investigators found city officials had drawn an official map dividing the city into southern and northern hemispheres, with downtown in the northern half. So to be clear, this map was drawn before Julian Castro became the Housing and Urban Development Director. So this was under Barack Obama's administration. His HUD, his first HUD director, basically was showing that Dallas and real estate developers there and the mayor of Dallas was essentially drawing a segregated map so that affordable housing wouldn't be put in where white people live. It wouldn't be put in downtown Dallas where they're trying to gentrify like everywhere else in this country, but it would be put where affordable housing already was, i.e. segregation, segregated housing. The report said the evidence shows that there was a pattern of negative reactions to projects that would provide affordable housing in the northern sector of Dallas, and those decisions were inconsistent with the goals required by HUD program obligations. At one point, Dallas city officials discovered that a new federal bond program for housing threatened to mess up their map. City Hall had counted on using the new bonds to spur redevelopment downtown. But after accepting hundreds of millions of dollars in new bond authorization, the city learned that to its dismay that the bonds, called Housing and Economic Recovery Act, or HERR bonds, carried an ironclad requirement that any multifamily housing project funded with the HERR bonds had to include at least 51% affordable units. HUD money was always supposed to carry that requirement, but Dallas and many other officials for decades have been able to skate out of the requirement by getting HUD to grant waivers. With backing from Obama, Donovan had decreed a new no more waivers policy, and the rules for the Herod bonds were the first hard incursion of that policy. Once Dallas found out that the Herod bonds wouldn't allow waivers, the city couldn't get rid of them fast enough. The HUD report on Dallas said, quote, the city did not use any of the Herod bonds that were allocated to it. In April 2010, the city voted to return at least $75 million to the state for use by a group out of Austin, Texas. The remainder of the bonds was allowed to expire. The investigation of Dallas was spurred by two real estate developers, Curtis Lockey and Craig McKenzie, who in 2010 accused Dallas of sabotaging their proposed renovation of a downtown office tower, launched in 2007. Backed by recordings of meetings and other evidence, Lockey and McKenzie said city officials pulled the rug out from under their deal, effectively killing their funding, because city officials were afraid their renovated downtown tower would become home to too many minorities. The city told HUD investigators that it rejected Lockey and McKenzie because of the problems with their financing. But after going through deal after deal between the city and other downtown developers, the HUD investigators decided they didn't buy the city's story. To expedite this story, the handsome Castro came into office. Once he arrived at HUD, he found the agency just about to bring down the hammer on Dallas. So what did he do? He reversed it. HUD wanted a lot before Castro got there. It wanted the city town where they were building up and gentrifying. It wanted an end to affordable housing projects being stuffed into already segregated, tough neighborhoods. It wanted those projects shifted out into wider, more affluent areas instead. But the big one was this. HUD demanded that the Dallas City Council enact an ordinance requiring all multifamily landlords in the city to accept federal Section 8 housing vouchers. To the Dallas real estate establishment, this was still an anathema. Castro had been in office merely months when he was called by Dallas Mayor Mike Rawlings. Nominally a Democrat, but really a Democrat in name only, Rawlings is a wealthy former advertising executive and investor selected to be mayor by the private and powerful Dallas Citizens Council. Rawlings said later he had spoken to Castro about the Dallas case 3 times on the phone. Apparently the third call was the charm. Castro caved. The brand new secretary decreed his agency's own investigators had screwed up their investigation, looked at all the wrong things, and left out key evidence. Castro said he didn't agree with the proposed settlement. Shock. So, in English, because that was a very long story, so basically Julian Castro reversed the HUD secretary before him decision to force Dallas to stop racial housing segregation. This, he talks about in his opening speech, we're gonna, everyone has to have the same opportunities in America without giving any policy or no substance. Everybody needs to have the same opportunity in America. Well, why did you reverse a HUD program that was about to drop the hammer, like that article said, on Dallas for racial segregation? The HUD, before Julian Castro came in, was trying to force at least 51% of affordable housing for at least 51% of downtown to have affordable housing. Why would Julian Castro reverse that? Could it be that he works for big real estate developers rather than minority communities like Latinos and African Americans that would be helped by affordable housing? Again, we don't have a huge record to go on here, folks. He was a mayor of San Antonio, and he was the director of housing and urban development. So, as director of housing and urban development, he sold foreclosed homes foreclosed on by Wall Street banks to, here, say it with me, Wall Street banks. Again, letting the arsonist who just burned down the house be the one that gets the contract to rebuild the house. He also reversed a HUD investigation, saying that the HUD investigators, before he came in, they didn't know what they were looking at. They looked at the wrong things. And basically gave a huge kiss, a huge sloppy wet kiss to Dallas's real estate developers, who I'm sure are going to pay him back now that he's running for office. He basically reversed HUD's impending decision to force Dallas to stop racial housing segregation. Yeah, this is the new progressive hope for America. I mean, I'll read to you what some of his policy positions supposedly are. I'm pretty suspect on all of this, but I'll read to you what they say it is. Castro has criticized President Donald Trump for withdrawing from the Paris Climate Change Accord. Castro's overall approach in public affairs was to try to convince businesses to increase their reliance on renewable energy voluntarily. Yeah, because businesses are going to definitely decrease their carbon emissions and pollutions just because you asked them kindly, sir. He wants to establish universal pre-K education, which he did as mayor of San Antonio. He established pre-kindergarten program. He supports universal pre-kindergarten nationally. I'm not opposed to that. Gun control, he's for a universal background checks, ban assault weapons. For that. Says he's for Medicare for all, but if you're for Medicare for all, why didn't you talk about it in your announcement speech that was being nationally televised? So, there's a lot of people that said they were for Medicare for all. Barack Obama said he was for a single-payer system. Then he gave us a Republican health care plan. So I want to know who's been fighting for Medicare for all before they ran for president, not now. Because he wasn't talking about Medicare for all when he was trying to become Hillary Clinton's vice president. I can promise you that. I remember I was on the campaign trail. Julian Castro wasn't for Medicare for all when he was on the campaign trail. On ICE, he wants to allow a pathway to citizenship for most undocumented immigrants, reconstitute U.S. immigration and customs enforcement. Castro supports comprehensive immigration reform, including a path to citizenship for most of the estimated 11 million undocumented people in the United States. Castro opposes Trump's border wall plan and instead has proposed securing the border by using technology and a more efficient legal immigration process. Okay, immigration is an easy thing to be right on. Abortion should remain legal after 20 weeks. Gay marriage is a protected right. He's good on those issues, but on the economy, I don't see it. Syria, withdraw U.S. presence over a planned period of time. Of course, we always hear in a planned period of time, and that planned period of time means never. And he strongly supported NAFTA when he was mayor of San Antonio, but now he says the agreement should be renegotiated. So, for NAFTA when he was mayor of San Antonio. So I think what you're seeing here, folks, is a kind of policy by the polls. He's reading the polls. He's seeing that Medicare for all is now at 70% approval. He's seeing that people don't like NAFTA, and that was a big thing that Donald Trump successfully ran on, being against NAFTA. But where were you when it was politically courageous to be for these things? Again, it wasn't for Medicare for all in 2016 when he was doing everything humanly possible to be named Hillary Clinton's vice president. I've never heard him talk about free public college. In his announcement speech, at least the part that I saw, he didn't say a word about climate change. So I got to tell you, number one, I don't think Julian Castro has the experience to be president of the United States. And number two, I don't think Julian Castro has the consistent, progressive record to be president of the United States. I don't care what you say now. I care what your record is. You don't have a big record. Do we want to elect another person without a record that sounds wonderful and lifts our spirits and talks about bringing people together who, at the same time, at night, are literally meeting with Wall Street executives, fossil fuel executives, big pharma executives, real estate developers? I think we've been there, done that. So I will report more on Julian Castro's record. I will report more. It looks like Sherrod Brown, Senator of Ohio, is beginning to make waves about possibly running for president. Kamala Harris is going to be running for president. So we'll keep reporting on their records as more people formally announce